welcome to another Bright News discussion. My name is Shannon Braswell, and today I'm joined by Dr. Michael Weiss. Without further ado, Dr. Michael Weiss, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Shannon, for having me on. And,
Great, it's my
looking
pleasure.
forward to our discussion.
Yeah, me too. All right, so for starters, can you just tell us a little about yourself and your work?
Sure. So I am a professor of linguistics in the Department of Linguistics at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. I work on the Indo-European languages. So I study the history of a family of languages which is spread throughout most of Europe and South Asia, and how those languages are related to each other and where they came from and how they changed over time. And particularly, I've written especially about the history of Latin and its relatives, and also some about Greek and some about the other ancient languages of Italy, like Oscan and Umbrian, plus some other stuff.
Okay, cool. Well, that's great. Well, hopefully we'll get into a little bit of those things as we go along. So my first question is about the time frame of the emergence of Proto Indo-European. Do you know when Indo-European sort of emerged?
Yeah. So first, let me just say, let me say a little bit about the idea of Indo-European, right? So
Okay.
when we look at a lot of languages of Europe, like English, German, French, Latin, we see that they have a tremendous number of similarities, right? And the further back in time we go, if we look at their ancestors like Old English and Latin, we see that there are even more similarities. And these similarities, require some sort of explanation, because it's obviously not just chance that they look so similar. There's just too many similarities.
Right.
And when you look at all the data, the only hypothesis that really makes sense is that they come from a common ancestor. And that common ancestor is not written down. It's not attested. And we only know about it by inference. And that's what we call Proto-Indo-European. So the question is, to get back to your more specific question, when was Proto-Indo-European spoken? And well, we can kind of estimate this in two different ways. So first of all, we know that it had to be before the earliest attested evidence for any of the actual Indo-European languages. Right. And the earliest evidence we have there would probably be evidence for Hittite. Hittite was an ancient Indo-European language spoken in Anatolia. It's extinct branch now. And the very earliest evidence we have for Hittite, it's about 1900, 2000 BC. And these are names in documents in Akkadian, which is not an European language, but we know that there were Akkadians who had a trading colony there, and they interacted with the local people, and they show us that Hittite was already spoken at that time. So about 2000 BC is our very earliest evidence for a specific Indo-European language. So we know Indo-European had to be quite a bit before that. Now, the other thing we can say is that there are certain pieces of technology which we can date archaeologically. Right. And if Indo-European has a reconstructible word for those, then we can hypothesize that the speakers of Indo-European knew that particular piece of technology and must have still been in a unified form when that technology was introduced. And probably the most important and famous word of that sort is the word for wheels and wheeled vehicles. So the wheel first shows up in the archaeological record a little bit before 3500 BC. So we have wheels from ancient Mesopotamia from about that time, but we also have the depiction of a wheeled vehicle from a place called Brno-Cice in Poland, which dates to about 3600. So when we look at the Indo-European reconstructible vocabulary, we see that almost all the Indo-European languages have a word for wheel, and that word is kwekblos. Right? So this is actually the source of the Sanskrit word chakra, which you might know from Ayurvedic medicine, and it's the source of our English word wheel, as it used to be pronounced. And it's the sort of the Greek word kuklos, which usually means circle.
Okay.
So we know that the speakers of Indo-European, at least most of them, and I'll get back to that point, were familiar with wheels. So that means that Indo-European, at least again, most of it was still in place after 3500 BC. So that kind of gives us a time frame for the breakup of Indo-European has happened perhaps in stages between 3500 BC and 2000.
Okay.
Now, the one caveat there is that in Anatolian, that's the branch which Hittite is descended from, we don't have any evidence for any of that wheeled vehicle terminology. So I just mentioned the word for wheel, but we also have words for axle and the pole that connects the chariot to the horses or the cart to the horses. And that is almost all absent in Hittite. So people have used that argument to suggest that the ancestor of Hittite and the Anatolian languages probably separated from Indo-European before the development of the wheel. So that would be before, say, 3600 BC. Okay. So somewhere in that period, 4000, 3600 was when Indo-European apparently first started to break up. And then it was probably a kind of, gradual fissure. Let us say one branch went off and then the others still were together. And then another branch went off. And we have a pretty good idea for the first two of those branchings, but not for later ones. So just to sum up that answer, yeah, somewhere Indo-European was spoken somewhere between 45 and 3500 BC.
Okay. Now I'm gonna try to, based on what you said, I'm gonna assume that since Anatolian and Hittite, or the Hittites lived in Anatolia, then they must have, and they broke off, then that must mean that that's not exactly where Indo-European originated, like geographically, right?
Well, that's a real question of debate today.
Okay.
So yeah, let me say a little bit about that. So,
Okay.
how do we know where Indo-European was spoken, right? This is a very, very difficult question, which has occupied scholars for, more than 100 years, 150 years. And one thing we can say is that, the reconstructed vocabulary points to some sort of temperate climate, right? So we don't have words for, things like fig tree or palm tree or anything like that we can reconstruct, but we do have words for, certain kinds of, pine trees, like a fir tree. We have a word for snow. We have a word for certain kinds of animals, which are relatively limited distribution. So we're sort of looking for somewhere in a temperate region, broadly speaking. Now, the suggestions which have been put forward, which command a lot of allegiance or have at various times, are either the region which is usually referred to as the Pontic-Caspian steppe, right, which is essentially the kind of flat region north of the Black Sea. It's now actually divided between Ukraine and Russia, right where the war is going on. Right. And that's the hypothesis which I think most scholars believe. There was, back in the 80s, there was a scholar named Colin Renfrew, who was an archaeologist, and his argument was that maybe Anatolia was actually the starting point. And he identified the expansion of Indo-European languages with a much earlier expansion, which we can identify archaeologically, from Anatolia, beginning around 8000 BC, which brought farming into Europe. So that was his hypothesis. Okay. Now, I think most linguists don't believe that hypothesis. And one of the reasons is that that's a really long time ago, A, and B, it would be very unlikely that we would have a word for wheel, which was common to the European languages, if they broke up 8000 BC, which is 4000 years before there were wheels, right? Right. So those are the two kind of large hypotheses which existed in this scholarship around 2000, right? Now, what's really changed that a lot is the advent of ancient DNA studies. Okay. And what those have shown, for sure, is that around 3000, there were massive expansions of people carrying certain genetic characteristics, both into Western Europe and into Central Asia. So basically places where we know the Indo-European languages arrived. So even though archaeologists were a little bit dubious about whether people actually moved or there were those cultural styles that spread, we now know for sure that people did move from that Pontic-Caspian steppe at about the time when the European languages were spoken. Okay, but that has not solved the problem. And the reason is that when we look at Anatolia, we don't have that much ancient DNA from Anatolia because they mainly burned their bodies, and it's just, we don't have a great picture yet. But the picture which we have so far does not show, so far, any of the same steppe ancestry which we see in Europe in the so-called in the corded ware culture around 3000, 2800 BC, or in the Yamnaya culture, or in the Afanasievo culture, so all the places where we think Indo-European was spread. We don't see that DNA in Anatolia. And so the question is, how did Indo-European language get there?
Yeah.
And one theory would be to say, well, they did start in the steppe, and we just don't have enough evidence yet to really find the trace of steppe ancestry in Anatolia yet, or that it got so diluted. There's lots of things that we could say, but the proposal that some ancient DNA scholars, a guy named Lazaridis in a paper from 2022 has put forward, is that maybe really Indo-Europeans started kind of in between the steppe and Anatolia, right? So let's say the northern Caucasus region, right? And then the idea which they suggest is that, the ancestors of the Anatolian speakers just went to the south west, right? And the rest of them went to the Pontic-Caspian steppe. So that neither place would be the homeland, right? It would sort of be an in-between region.
Right.
And so that idea is out there. And I have to say, I don't have a firm opinion of this, but I'm kind of sympathetic to that idea.
Yeah, it's like a compromise, right?
It's kind of a compromise. And there's actually one piece of evidence which I think is really interesting. And that's that we can reconstruct an Indo-European word for wine. So this is the word which we have in Greek. It's oinos, and that goes from earlier oinos. And we also have it in Hittite. It's in the form wian. So not only do we have that word, right? If you had that word, you could say, well, it was borrowed from somebody, right? Somebody else. Right. But it actually is derived from an Indo-European root, which we know means something like twist or turn, which is used of vines. Right?
Yes. Okay.
So it really seems to be an Indo-European word, right? And that word is also probably borrowed into some Caucasian languages like Georgian. Georgian is a member of the so-called Kartvelian family, which is not Indo-European. So wine, as far as we know, was invented in the Caucasus, right? Around 8000 BC. I think that's about when, or maybe a little bit later. And if Indo-European really started in the steppe, right, it would be very funny that they would have a native word for wine, right? Because they didn't grow wine there, right? There was no vineyards there until Greek times.
Right.
So I think that particular piece of evidence is actually consistent with the Lazaridis hypothesis about an origin in the Northern Caucasus. But, I don't know for sure. But the one thing we can say is that all of the Indo-European languages, except for Anatolian, almost certainly dispersed from the Pontic-Caspian steppe region.
Okay. Now here's my other question, and I don't know how controversial this is right now within the research, but there's this other hypothesis. There's this to say that Indo-Europeans moved from the Caucasus or the steppe, right, into Asia, right? For some people, that really doesn't bode well, right? And that's kind of like a problem. They think that, I've heard scholars saying that, they didn't come from the East. They were already in India. They were already, in around that area. And
Right.
so, I mean, how does that, yeah, what's the,
Yeah. So there's an alternative. Okay. So if you follow the kind of intellectual discourse in India,
Mhm.
you'll often hear just a contrast made between the out of India hypothesis
Right.
or the what they usually refer to as the Indo-Aryan invasion hypothesis, right?
Yes. Okay.
And
Right.
many people in India, particularly people who are interested in Hindutva, which is Indian nationalism, et cetera, are
Mhm.
quite insistent that Sanskrit, which is one of the Indo-European languages, didn't come from any place outside of India, right?
Yeah.
And further, that the whole idea of Indo-European is a kind of colonialist myth, right?
Mm.
That is somehow was created by Westerners in order to subjugate Indian autonomy, I think is how that would be phrased fairly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Okay.
so, well, then the question is, what, how does this correlate with what we think we know, right?
Right.
Both in terms of archaeology, in terms of genetics, and in terms of linguistics.
Mhm.
And I think I mean, obviously, if you have a scholar devoted to the out of India hypothesis, you'll hear their point of view. But
Right.
my point of view is that it doesn't really, it's not it's not as plausible hypothesis as the Pontic-Caspian steppe. And let me just give you a little bit of evidence for why I think that.
Okay.
So first of all, we have pretty clear evidence that the ancestor of, so the Indic languages are related very closely to the ancient Iranian languages, or to the languages too. Oh, sorry.
Right.
And so they form what we call a subgroup, Indo-Iranian, right? And where was, maybe we can take a more simple question is, where was Indo-Iranian spoken?
Yeah.
And I think
Okay.
we're pretty certain that Indo-Iranian was spoken in Central Asia. So say, let's say in the country of Kazakhstan, et cetera.
Mhm.
And how do we know that? Well, we know that because there are a huge number of loanwords from Proto-Indo-Iranian into the Uralic languages, right? So the Uralic
Okay.
languages are spoken, well, I mean, Finnish is a Uralic language, Hungarian is a
Right.
Uralic language, but they almost certainly started someplace, much further to the east, and there's still languages like Samoyed, which is spoken, in
Hung-
northern Siberia, or
Hungarian.
Hungarian is one too, right? But
Okay.
they moved
Okay.
a long distance, right? But they started
Yeah.
out, we know historically, in the Ural region, right? So we have words which are loaned from Proto-Indo-Iranian into Uralic, right? So just to
Okay.
give you an example, the word for 100, which in Sanskrit is shatam and in Western is satam, is
Mhm.
almost the same in the Uralic languages. And we know it's
Okay.
borrowed in that direction, right? Because the
Right.
100 word is related to the other Indo-European words.
Right.
There's a word for servant, I think is the word, right? Which is borrowed from the Sanskrit word. There's lots of words. There's probably 100, 150 quite convincing cases of items which were
Right.
borrowed. So if India, the ancestor of the Indic languages, was always spoken in India, right? Then how did this happen? This is quite difficult to explain if you
Mhm.
always have speakers of, if India is the original point of distribution.
Right.
So that's argument one.
Okay.
Argument two is that, if we look at the archaeological record, it's pretty clear that there was an expansion from the Pontic-Caspian steppe into Europe around, a little after 3000. And we can see this when we look at the genetics, right? So the so-called Yamnaya culture and the
Right.
people of the Yamnaya culture and the people of the corded ware culture are very similar genetically, right?
Okay.
So that's consistent with an expansion from the Pontic-Sastrian steppe into Western Europe, which could have introduced the Indo-European languages. At the same time, we have introduction of Yamnaya ancestry into far East Central Asia in the so-called Afanasyevo culture. That happened around 3000, maybe a little bit earlier. So that's in it's close to where Lake Baikal is in Siberia, right? And you know, most people think, and I think for good reason, that the Afanasyevo culture is the expansion of the Yamnaya, which introduced the people who eventually moved further south to introduce Tochari, right?
Okay.
So if we look at, you know, where the Indo-European languages are, we can see and where the archaeological and genetic expansions are. Not talking about India at all, right? But if we look at those two expansions, we see we have quite good vectors for the introduction of European languages into those areas. But if we look at India, right, and say, okay, let's hypothesize that India was the starting point, I don't think, I'm not an expert, right? I don't think we can point to comparable expansions, either genetically or archaeologically. So that's those two arguments. The third argument, I would say, would be, you know, is India, let's say, so, okay, the place where we get the Indo-European, the old Indic languages earliest is the Indus Valley, right? That's where the Rig Veda was written in, you know, basically in Indus Valley. We know that because they refer to, you know, rivers, which we still have the same name. It's pretty clear. It was in Northwest India, right? So is the flora and fauna, which we see there, comparable to the reconstructible flora and fauna of Indo-European, right? And I think the answer is that it's not very comparable, right? So for those reasons, you know, I'm pretty dubious of that out of India hypothesis. I should say, from my point of view, this is a politically motivated hypothesis, right? It's people want to claim antiquity for themselves, and this is a natural thing that, you know, people all over the world do. And, you know, there's no doubt that Indo-European itself has lots of political aspects to it, right? You know, if we go back to, let me just go back a little bit before the 20th century, right? So, you know, back in before the Pontic-Caspian steppe hypothesis was generally believed, and this goes back to a German scholar named Otto Schrader, there was another hypothesis, and that hypothesis put Proto-European right in Prussia, right in northern Germany, right? And, you know, who had that opinion? Well, it was Prussians, basically, right? And the argument was kind of clever, right? So that they said, we can reconstruct Indo-European word for salmon, fish, right? And let's say that refers to the Atlantic salmon. So we'll draw a line on the map showing all the places where Atlantic salmon live, right? We also have an Indo-European word for beech tree. This is how the argument went. So let's draw a line on the map for where we find beech trees, right? And let's superimpose those two lines, right? So the beech tree basically grows, the beech tree which they had in mind, grows to the west of a line going from Königsberg, or Kaliningrad, as I think it's called today, to Odessa, right? So from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And the Atlantic salmon is basically in rivers going into the Baltic, right? So if you put those two together, you get Prussia, right? That was the argument, right? But this doesn't hold up, right? Because it's kind of cherry picking. And you might say, well, how do we know it's specifically the Atlantic salmon? And how do we know it's specifically the beech tree, which we call Fagus sylvatica? We don't know, right? The thing is that these terms are not specific enough and not fixed enough that we can really use them the way scholars did back in those days. But those guys were, you know, obviously engaging in motivated thinking because they wanted it to be Northern Germany, right? And so everyone obviously is, you know, embedded in the cultures that they're working in, and they're going to have, you know, motivated thinking. Our scholarly endeavor is to overcome the motivated thinking in ourselves as much as possible.
Right. right. I mean, that makes sense. Now, I want to maybe step back a little. I mean, we can get into um, that a little bit later because I want to talk to you about the term Aryan and that whole thing. But I want to step back and talk about the religious component, like the rituals and symbols and things like that, and sort of maybe some of the words that might be um, that retain some of the I guess the consciousness of that group.
Mhm, mhm.
Can we talk a little bit about that? Like you know, what kind of symbols, what kind of rituals were they doing? And I mean, I know we don't have texts that can tell
Right.
us like exactly what, the Proto Indo-Europeans were doing, but is there is there a way to
Yes,
sort of, yeah,
to some extent there is, right? So,
okay,
you know, so if you look at the, uh, I think the most secure way to approach this problem
mhm,
is through linguistics, right?
okay,
We can
yes,
reconstruct certain words
mhm,
which have clear religious content, right? So
right,
let me give you a couple examples, right?
okay,
So in Sanskrit, there is a god who is called Dyaus Pitar, right? Dyaus
okay,
Pitar. And he's not
okay,
a very important god in Sanskrit. The important gods are Indra and so forth, and Agni. Those are the top two, right? But
right,
in ancient in the Rig Veda, there's a god Dyaus Pitar, and he's the uh, embodiment of the daytime sky, right? His
okay,
name means sky. Tiaus means sky, and that's actually just used as a regular word for day or sky. And
okay,
Pitar, which is the word for father, right?
right,
So it means
right,
sky father, right?
yes,
That word exactly matches, sound for sound, the word, the Latin word for their chief god, who is Jupiter, right?
okay,
Jupiter is from Deus Picter, which is the
okay,
reconstruction, and that's
okay,
exactly
yeah,
Skyfather, right? In
okay,
in Italy, Jupiter is that's the big guy, right? That's the chief god.
right,
In Greece, their chief god is Zeus, and
right,
Zeus goes back to their Deus, right? Which is the first part of that name, sky, right?
right,
There's also we have Zeus is referred to as pater, that's the Greek word for father, a lot.
right,
So just from those three languages, it's pretty clear that there was a god who was pretty important, who
mhm,
represented the daytime sky and was regarded in some sense as a father, right? Was he a
right,
father? And it's not really clear what that means, right? But
right,
that's one part of the religious the lexicon, which we can reconstruct by linguistic methods, which
mhm,
has a clear reference to a part of the theology of the speakers, right?
right,
This idea,
right,
right?
mhm,
Uh, and there are other aspects that we can reconstruct in that way. So the general word for God in Indo-European is Deus, right? Deus. And
mhm,
that word we have in Latin Deus, and
mhm,
we have it in Sanskrit Deva, and it's there in actually in Norse in Tyr. It's actually this god who gives us Tuesday, uh,
okay,
and it's there, in other places as well.
right,
And that name for God is actually related to the word for sky, right?
okay,
So the word for sky was something like Deus, and this is Deus. So they had a little derivational process that they applied to this, and
mhm,
that it tells us that they thought the gods lived in the sky, right?
right,
So they were the ones of the sky, basically.
right, right,
On the other hand, we can contrast that with a reconstructible word for human beings.
mhm,
This is the word which in Latin is homo, right? The word for man.
mhm, mhm,
And it's also there in other branches of Indo-European, Lithuanian. It's there in English.
okay,
Well, we only have it in. It's been transformed in the word bridegroom, which used to be
okay,
bridegoom. The goom part
okay,
there was a general word for man, and then people forgot that word and they made it into groom.
okay,
Lithuanian word is jmo, right?
okay,
So these words are all related to the word for earth, which we have in Latin, humus, right? So
okay,
homo and humus are related, right? And they mean earthlings, basically, right? So
right,
you can see just from that linguistic fact that there was some sort of opposition between the gods of the sky dwellers, and the earthlings, who are the humans, right?
Okay.
So we can say a good bit about, the kind of overarching sort of pantheon to some extent, right? I mean, there's a lot of innovation, right? So, if you look at all the gods of ancient India, Indra and Agni and so forth, very few of them really can be traced under that name back to Indo-European, right?
Okay.
But it does seem likely that, some of the sort of concepts that they represent, so Indra as a storm god, probably existed in Indo-European under different names, right? So the name might get replaced, but the sort of theological kind of construct around the name gets replaced by another name, right? Or continues under another name.
Right.
So as far as sacrifice goes, so I think you could be pretty certain that, the Indo-European speakers of Proto-Indo-European practice some sort of sacrificial rituals, which involved animal sacrifice. And of course, that's not an amazing, right? Because most ancient peoples around the world practice animal sacrifice of some sort or another. It would be unusual if they didn't, right?
Sure.
But we're lucky in that we have very detailed ritual descriptions from various parts of the world. So especially ancient India, right? Where the post-Vedic, the Rig Veda itself is part of a ritual practice. The post-Vedic Rig Vedic literature gives a much more detail about how to actually perform that. And we can see that, that ritual practice is very closely related to the ritual practice which we see in ancient Iran. So to get concrete, one of the main aspects of ancient Indian religion was soma, right? Soma was a plant which was pressed in a special way, and then people drank it, and it had some sort of effect, right? It kind of made them, see the gods in some sense, right? Yeah. We can say hallucinate if you want to put it that way.
Sorry, okay.
Right. Keep it neutral, right? So that word soma is derived from a root which we have in Vedic to mean, to press. And it has an exact match in Avestan. Now, Avestan is the most anciently attested Iranian language. And the word there is hauma, right? So H corresponds to S. So Avestan H corresponds to Sanskrit S. And so hauma and soma are the same thing. And so we can say the ancestors of the speakers of Iranian and the speakers of Indic, the Proto-Indo-Iranians, they had that practice, right? They used that a plant, right, in their ritual. And in India, we see that maintains itself as a very important part of the whole the ritual in the Vedic period. In Iran too, we see that, but the Iranian religion underwent a kind of revolution through Zarathustra, right? Zarathustra is the prophet of what's now referred to as the Zoroastrian religion. And he introduced all sorts of new aspects, right? He created this kind of this system of oppositions between the creative, positive spirit, or Mazda, and the negative spirit, right? The division of the universe, the physical universe, into creatures which are good and creatures which are bad, et cetera, et cetera. Very complicated religion still practiced by people in India and Iran and other places. But he didn't get rid of Soma worship, right? That continued under the name Homa, continues to this day as part of Zoroastrianism. So that's one part of the picture that we can reconstruct for Proto-Indo-Iranian. Whether we can reconstruct for Proto-European, it's not so clear. We don't have, very good evidence for it elsewhere. The other question is, well, what was this plant, right? And here there's just many, many different theories. So I won't go into it, but it shows that we can use linguistic evidence to reconstruct, not only concepts like theological concepts, but also ritual practice to some extent.
Okay, and so on the flip side, what can we say for what can we say for the Italic, the Italic, Celtic,
Mhm.
say sort of Germanic, Baltic, you know, groups
Yeah,
and their sort of ritual practices and
right. So
myths.
there we do have, from ancient Italy,
Mhm.
uh, we have some quite detailed information. Now, on the Latin side, it's kind of fragmentary because we don't really get kind of like handbooks or detailed descriptions of the practice. So you have to put it together from many different references. Sometimes, you only
Mhm.
hear about it from somebody like St. Augustine or Arnobius,
Mhm.
a Christian writer who, is criticizing the religious practice.
Right.
But actually, in ancient Italy, there is a language called Umbrian, which is a
Mhm.
pretty close relative of Latin. And
Okay.
in Umbrian, we have these incredible documents. They're called the Tabulae Iguinae, the Iguvine tablets or tables. And
Okay.
they're these bronze inscriptions. Some of them are about this. Well, I mean, you can't see this right, but some of
Sure.
them
I
are
like a
as
tablet.
big, yeah, as big
Okay.
as some of them are about as big as a dictionary, and some of them are
Mhm.
about as big as a small flat screen TV.
Okay.
And they describe in very great detail the ritual practices of the priestly brotherhood, they're called the Atiedian brothers, of this
Okay.
particular town, which is down in Gubbio in Italy. It was called Iguium in
Okay.
ancient times. And they really tell us a lot, right? They say, first you take this, mash of whatever, and you mix it with this, and then you
Mhm.
moisten it with water, and then you bury it, and it's really detailed.
Mhm.
And I wrote a book about one particular part of this. And
Okay.
what you can see is that, yeah, the ritual practice there is very similar to what we see in ancient Rome, as we pick them out. So you can sort of see there's a common practice for ritual in ancient Italy.
Right.
And in some cases, you can see that it has rather close parallels elsewhere in the Celtic world or in ancient India.
Mhm.
Uh, and they're but it's sort of hard to kind of really confidently reconstruct a ritual practice for Indo-European. At least I don't feel confident about that.
Right.
Now, as far as touching on the subject of Italic and Celtic, this is sort of a controversial linguistic idea.
Mhm.
Uh, the Celtic languages are still survive today, right? You've got Irish spoken in Ireland and Welsh spoken in Wales and Breton spoken in Brittany.
Right.
And until recently, you had Cornish, which was spoken in, until the 18th century, Cornish spoken in Cornwall.
Uh-huh.
And then before that, we had Celtic languages spoken basically in France, Gaulish, northern Italy, and
Right.
northern Spain, right?
Right.
And the thing is that in Ireland, we really don't have anything directly pagan, right? It's all been
Mhm.
Christianized. By the time we get there, we have various literature which refers back to pagan practices, but it's not really clear how much faith we should put in those.
Right.
But we do have pagan documents in Gaulish. Unfortunately, not that many.
Mhm.
Yeah, I should say pre-Christian rather than pagan, because that's pagan is a little pejorative. But
All right.
pre-Christian documents. And one thing which I think I was able to show in one of my papers is that we have a name of a god in ancient Italy. In Latin,
Mhm.
he shows up as Samo,
Okay.
and he also shows up in Oscan, same form. And
Mhm.
in Gaulish and also in Irish, we have a god whose name is Segomon, Segomu. And
Okay.
those can be shown to go back to the same protoform, right? It basically means something like, strong one, right? The strong god.
Okay.
And so that would be, as far as I know, the only kind of reconstructible, distinct name of a divinity for the Italo-Celtic stage, assuming there was Italo-Celtic. I should get back to that. I said that it was controversial.
Yeah.
I happen to believe that, on the way down from Indo-European, there was a period when there was a common ancestor of Italic and Celtic, Proto-Italo-Celtic. But a
Okay.
lot of people don't. A lot of
Right.
people just think that the similarities which there are between them are because they were in contact, that there was never a period when they were the same, right? which was
Okay.
distinct from the rest of Indo-European.
Mhm.
And I don't believe that. I believe the other hypothesis, but many
Right.
people disagree on this.
Dis
Yeah.
Disagree. Right. Okay. Well, now let's get down to the term Aryan,
Oh
right?
yeah.
But okay, but before we do that, actually let's get into you touched on this briefly, but I want to maybe sort of open this up with, and that is the contact with other linguistic families,
Mhm.
such as one of my other favorites is Afro-Asiatic, the
Mhm.
Afro-Asiatic
Mhm.
languages, and Dravidian.
Mhm.
Um, and I know that, like I know in the Bible, right? Like
Uriah the
Uriah,
Hittite. Yes. Yeah.
Uriah, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Uriah is a Hittite, right? And he's
Right.
the
Yeah.
former husband of Bathsheba, and that whole
Right.
story. We
Yeah.
won't get into that, but
Yeah.
but
Uh,
yeah.
yeah. Okay. So for sure there's been, you know, much contact with lots of other branches wherever the Indo-Europeans spread.
Hmm.
And yeah, well, actually, since you brought up Uriah the Hittite, that's sort of an
Hmm.
interesting topic.
Okay.
So yeah, the Hittite name, Ketim, I think it is in Hebrew, shows up a
Hmm.
couple places in the Bible. So
Hmm.
Abraham bought a cave for his eventual burial from the Hittites, it said.
Hmm.
And you kind of wonder what exactly does that mean. So the Hittites had an empire which was quite powerful, and that
Hmm.
empire lasted till about 1200 BC. So
Okay.
kind of everything in the Eastern Mediterranean except for Egypt sort of
Right.
fell apart around 1200. This is the
Right.
so-called Sea
The
Peoples
Bronze Age
and whatnot.
collapse.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah. Hmm.
exactly.
Hmm.
And but the Hittite culture, right, the culture which was associated with the Hittite Empire, actually
Hmm.
continued after that uh,
Okay.
in these smaller kingdoms, which had their kind of center more to the east, so in basically what's Syria today.
Hmm.
And we have a lot of documents, not in Hittite, but in a related language called Luvian, that are written in a special alphabet called Hieroglyphic Luvian.
Okay.
It's not an alphabet, it's a syllabary.
Okay.
Uh, and those people had these kind of kingdoms, not as powerful as the Hittite Empire, but they had, pretty powerful kingdoms in the eastern part of Anatolia and in northern Syria.
Hmm.
And these stayed, in existence until the expansion of the Assyrian Empire in
Okay.
the 9th and 8th century BC.
Okay.
So it's probably those guys,
Yeah.
that is, say, the successor states that are
Right.
referred to in the Bible, right, rather than the actual Hittite Empire. There
Okay.
definitely was contact between the Semitic languages and Hittite for sure. So, we know uh, about how sometimes it actually gives us interesting information. This
Hmm.
is another paper I wrote a
Hmm.
while back. So the area of the south eastern corner of Anatolia was referred to as Chiawa.
Okay.
And this is borrowed into the Semitic language, so into Akkadian, into Phoenician, and
Hmm.
Aramaic. That's something like Awe with a fa. And
Okay.
that actually could be important, right? Because why did they represent the ch sound as a k with a uvular k? It could be
Right.
because the ch sound was itself a so-called uvular, so not pronounced just like a ch, like in German, but rather h,
Mhm.
right, further back.
Right.
And uh, this would be evident. This is one of the kinds of evidence that we can extract from language contact, right?
Right.
As far
Right.
as loans go between Indo-European and Semitic, so obviously there are plenty of loans. Well, shouldn't say plenty, but there are certainly some
Mhm.
between Hittite and Semitic languages, uh, which is only natural, right? Because of
Right.
they're in contact.
Yeah.
Indo-European, it's a little bit more tricky, right? Because if Indo-European was spoken in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, or in let's say even in the northern Caucasus, there's still a lot of space in between where Proto-Semitic or Proto-Afrasic. Proto-Afrasic was primarily spoken in Africa, so even more space there, right?
Right.
Uh, But there are a couple of words which are, pretty strikingly similar. And one of those is the word for seven. So
Okay.
in European septum, and like Shabbat in Hebrew, or the Sabbath word, right? That's the seventh day of the week, right? So those two words look quite similar. And then the word for star in Indo-European is chaster.
Okay.
And that
Yes.
looks a lot like the god
The
Astarte,
goddess.
right? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So many people have been struck with this, and actually one more. The word for bull is
Okay.
taurus, right? The Latin word for bull, taurus, and
Uh-huh.
in Hebrew the word for bull is shor, and that we know goes back to something like a thau in Proto-Semitic.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
there does seem to be a little bit of contact,
Yeah.
and it's interesting, right? So because
Yeah.
again, it suggests if those are really genuine loan words, then it would be probably an argument against the Pontic-Caspian steppe as the original homeland.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
but they're very tricky. Those are
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Now I would like to ask you about the term Aryan, right?
Okay.
That we know that that's a
Yeah, that's a very loaded term today,
loaded
for
term,
good
right?
reasons. Yeah. Uh, so
So,
okay, so let's start with the ancient texts first, right? So
right.
in ancient India, in Vedic, there's a word Arya,
Mhm.
and that itself is derived from a kind of more basic term, which is Ari. And
Okay.
Ari,
Can I guess what it means first?
yeah, yes,
Okay. All right. I'm gonna guess what it means. Now I saw this on the video. This was a long time ago, but I'm guessing that the term means the civilized ones or the upright ones. Is that wrong to say that?
well, I
You
don't know if
probably know which
that's
video I'm talking about.
I don't know which one you're talking about,
Okay. All
but
right. All
no, I don't think that there's any particular reason to think that's well. Okay, no, I know what they're thinking of when they say that,
right. Okay.
and I could see how you come with hypothesis, but I don't know if it's correct, and I'll tell you what
Okay.
my favorite hypothesis is in a
Okay.
second, right?
All right. All right.
Okay, so we have this word ari. What does this word mean? It
Mhm.
actually it's kind of almost contradictory. It means both kind of like uh, an enemy, right?
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
but in some places it means a kind of member of a kind of related community, right? So a member
Okay.
of community. And so if we look at the Sanskrit texts, and
Mhm.
also strangers is something that seems to me. So it kind of seems
Okay.
to be this ambivalent word, right? And if overall, it really seems to mean something like person who, maybe isn't our friend, maybe they're our rival, but they're still kind of part of the same group that we belong to.
Right.
So there's a god, Aryaman. Aryaman is derived from Arya, apparently.
Okay.
And it's usually translated as the god of the customary community, right? So
Okay.
all the customs that we people do in ancient India are
Mhm.
represented by this god Aryaman.
Okay.
And so that's what Ari and Arya seem to mean, basically, right? They mean somebody who's part of the community.
Okay.
Okay,
Right.
so that's India. If we
Mhm.
look at Iran, at Iranian, we see that they have that same word, Arya,
Mhm.
right? It means more
Mhm.
or less the same thing, right?
Mhm.
And in fact, the name of Iran, right, is from Aryanam, which means the
Right.
land of the Arya, right? It's the genitive
Right.
plural, right?
Right. Right.
So we can for sure say that the Indo-Iranians, right, the common ancestors of the Indic languages, the Iranian languages,
Mhm.
call themselves Arya. Okay,
Right.
so that's
Okay.
what we can say historically. Now,
Mhm.
is there any evidence for that word elsewhere in Indo-European, which would justify projecting that ethnonym all the way back to Proto-European? And here it's a little bit tricky. There is in Irish a word Arya, spelled A-I-R-E, Arya. And this means basically kind of a free person, right? So
Okay.
somebody who is not enslaved.
Mhm.
Sometimes it means something more like noble, but it basically means a kind of free citizen. And
Mhm.
uh, that word has often been compared with the Arya. The thing
Right.
is that we really can't prove that because because of the historical changes which have happened in Irish, it's entirely possible that, for example, there was a P at the beginning of the word, which just disappeared, right?
Okay.
And the other thing is that that word declines differently. So it has the oblique stem of it is Arya, etc. So anyways, that's too much detail. But so that's really a little bit dubious whether that word is the same. So for sure we can say Proto-Indo-European speakers, yeah, they refer to themselves as Arya. Whether it went back beyond that, we don't know. Okay. Now, yeah. So now, what is the etymology of that, right? Does it have a particular meaning? So the whoever's video you were watching is presumably thinking that this is related to the root, which means to fit or be, proper, fitting, basically. And we have this root in Vedic. It's the word. Well, we have a derivative urtam, which means kind of order, cosmic order, right? And then we have this word probably in Hittite. So there's an idiom, nata'ara, which means not correct, right? Nata'ara. If something is bad, it's nata'ara, not correct. And there's a verbal root which we have in Greek, which means to fit, ararisko. And so yeah, people have thought that that's the connection. It could be, right? Yeah. So okay, so that's the historical facts about it. Now, back in the early 19th century, right? People, were struck by this term, right? And they assume, well, I should also say, back in the really early days of Indo-European, there was a very great tendency, Indo-European studies, I should say, there was a really great tendency to identify Sanskrit with Indo-European, right? Because when European scholars first learned about Sanskrit, they were just so impressed with its system and its archaism, et cetera. They thought, well, this is, this is the proto-language, basically. Right. Yeah. So people thought, well, if that's what they call themselves, right? If that's the Iranian people call themselves, maybe that's what the Proto-Europeans call themselves too. Right. Okay. So now, here is where it gets ugly, right? So in the 19th century, right, there, we get this kind of development of racial science. And this is, I guess, one of the founders of this is a French scholar named Gobelin, G-O-B-L-I-N. And, he was maybe, I think, the first one to kind of seize upon this, right? That, this was the Indo-European name for the Indo-Europeans, right? And associate this with Northern European appearance and Northern European peoples, right? So he transferred it, so the term originates as a self-designation for people of ancient India and Iran. It was transferred to the ancestors of the proto-language, and then it was transferred, specifically to Western Europeans who had blonde hair and blue eyes, right? Sure. So that idea, right, which starts probably in the early mid 19th century, really gets going, right? And eventually, right, all of that kind of sort of proto-Nazi ideology, well, it eventually ends up in the hands of the Nazis, right? So when they say Aryan, right, they're referring to the mythical ancestors of the Proto-Europeans who had blonde hair and eyes and were responsible for everything good in the world, right? Which is, it's just completely crazy and has nothing to do with what the word actually means. Right. There are lots of people, this ideology doesn't go away, right? And I'm sure if you Google the word Aryan, you're going to find a lot of bad stuff, basically.
I'm not going to Google
it. So, but that's the history of the word, right? And whether it really was a self-designation of the Indo-Europeans or not, I don't think we can say for sure.
Okay. All right. Well, here's my last two questions. Okay. The Veneti, right? The Adriatic Veneti versus like all the other two Venetis, because I know there's like a like the Celtic Veneti, and then there's
Yes.
the Baltic Veneti, or
Yes. Yeah,
so
there's at least three of them. Yeah.
right. So
Right.
so first, who are the Adriatic Veneti, and then secondly, what language family do they belong to? Are they Italic? Are they Celtic? Are they
Yeah.
Germanic?
Right.
What?
Yeah, this is
Yeah,
a really good question. I did write a paper about this. So
yeah.
okay. So in the north east of Italy, right, basically in the region of Italy, which is Venezia today.
Hmm.
So not in the town of Venice, but in the region around there, basically.
Hmm.
We have decent number of inscriptions. I don't remember. It's somewhere between 300 and 500 inscriptions.
Hmm.
They're mainly short. They're written in an alphabet, which is derived from the Etruscan alphabet, so like Latin, but a little bit different. And this is definitely an Indo-European language for sure.
Okay.
So, for example, the way you say the 10th day in Latin, right, would be decimus dies. That would be Latin, right? In Venetic, we have the idiom decome die, meaning on the 10th day. So you can see it's quite close, right?
Right. Right.
So definitely an European language.
Mhm.
And the only topic of debate is it part of the Italic family, or is
Mhm.
it just a separate Indo-European branch, right?
Mhm.
Or is it some kind of, in between Italic and Germanic or Celtic, et cetera? And yeah, I think the consensus is, or at least my opinion, and I think my opinion represents a consensus,
Mhm.
is that it's a kind of Italic, right?
Okay.
And there are a couple of, we don't know a lot of it because the inscriptions are quite short, so we don't really know a lot about their, morphology, verbal morphology and whatnot.
Mhm.
But there are a couple of sound changes which are shared with Italic. There's a couple of lexical items which are quite similar to Italic, and so overall, it does look like it's kind of Italic. Okay.
Okay.
The people who lived in the north, I guess basically what's now Brittany,
Mhm.
those Veneti, they spoke a Celtic language in the historical period,
Okay.
for sure.
Mhm.
The third Veneti are the ones who lived basically to the east of the Germanic speakers.
Mhm.
And some people think that they maybe were kind of early Slavs. Other people think maybe there was some other European branch. So we don't really know what they spoke. But eventually that particular term for those guys to the east of Germanic does get applied to Slavic speakers. So
Okay.
there's a term in English, we have the term wend, W-E-N-D, which
Mhm.
is an old-fashioned term for Slavic speakers.
Okay.
And I think the name of Russia in Finnish is I think it's Vene. I wrote it in my
Okay.
paper, forgot the exact word. So again, from that same form.
Okay.
So okay.
Yeah.
So why we have these three names, people in different
Yeah.
parts, and there's various theories about this. Well, first of all,
Mhm.
are they the same? And I think for sure it's the same form,
Okay.
because it really actually we say they're the Veneti, but really the nominative plural of their name was probably originally Venetes, and each of the three branches you can show that the form, we call this an athematic noun, was originally an athematic noun in each of three branches. So that's a pretty strong argument that this was the same word which was applied to these three different groups, right?
Mhm.
So why is that the case? Well, one hypothesis would be that there was some tribe and they just traveled all over the place, and they
Yeah.
kind of eventually adopted this language and that
Right.
language, they switched language, and that's possible.
Yeah.
But I think I personally, in the absence of kind of any sort of solid archaeological information for, say, a connection between the Italic and the Celtic, or whatever the third group was,
Mhm.
I think it was just a really cool name, and
Yeah.
people liked it, right? So that it meant something.
Right.
There's a root in Indo-European which means to win, right? So basically it was, the winners, the champions.
Right.
And
Right.
this was somehow, very prone to be adopted as an ethnic name in different places in Western Europe, or Western and Central Europe. So that's my view on the relationship between the three.
Okay, great. That's a I'll take that. That suits me just fine. So let's see. Lastly, I want to ask about Proto Indo-European language in film and entertainment.
Okay.
Like like Prometheus,
Yes. Yeah.
and it's
Well,
got that.
I actually had a little bit to do with that.
Okay.
Although I haven't seen the movie. So
Oh,
I've been
really?
sort of, I've been avoiding the movie. Yeah.
Okay.
Uh,
All right.
I know that
It's not that bad.
yeah, that there's some in European, Proto-European stuff there. So yeah, I was contacted by there's a organization which is part of the National Science Foundation, which puts creative artists in contact with scholars when they're doing something, which I guess they could benefit from some scholarship. And
Yeah.
so I was contacted by one of the producers of the movie,
Yeah.
and he said, we want the sort of, I guess, the aliens there to speak some
Yeah.
sort of language, which is kind of be, sort of imposing
Uh-huh.
and which would give this theory of how the languages are related or something like that. So some really ancient language, which would sound imposing. I think that's what they said.
Okay. Right.
So I said, well, you could make it some historically attested language like, Akkadian or, ancient Greek or whatever. And I sent them to various kind of recordings of these languages produced in their, restored pronunciations. Or I said, well, you could do, Proto-European. And then I read them a little passage in reconstructed Proto-European as I thought it would be pronounced. And that's it. I never heard from him again. So,
Okay.
but I guess they ran with that somehow.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. They
and
took
I
that.
didn't get a credit for the movie or anything. So,
Well, it's all right. You gonna get credit on. You gonna get credit here, man.
yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
But so when in European shows up in the movies or film, it's it's always a little bit. You always think, they're going to screw it up and
Right.
whatnot. And I didn't see it, but
Right.
it's great that somebody. Let me just say one final thing, right? So I think everybody is really interested in how languages are related and how they change, and this is maybe one of the aspects which of linguistics, which I think regular people kind of care about, or at least interested in. What most linguists do. I don't want to disparage my colleagues, right? But what most linguists do is very technical, right? And very abstruse. And historical linguistics, and in European particular, really kind of is something which connects with something in broader culture. So I think it's a great way for people to learn something about linguistics and then go on to do whatever they do in linguistics.
Right.
So so I'm all for Indo-European in popular culture,
Yeah.
provided, right, that it's not somehow propping up some kind of, Nazi fantasy.
Sure.
So I think it's really great. I appreciate that you had me on and
Yeah.
talk about
Pleasure.
this a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I think we need to correct this idea that that this is politically suspect enterprise. I mean, it's a historical enterprise, and there's lots of all historical enterprises are equally valid, and this just happens to be one that that I happen to do. So
yes. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me, man. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it I think I got all my questions in. If not,
okay.
I'd love to have you back on, and we can
Sure,
chat again.
anytime. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to talk, and it's great pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure.
you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.